stand.
My Lord, it is the prosecution's case that on the evening of 15th of June 1973, at 42 Dorchester Close, the home of Christine Blandford, the accused, she did brandish, in a threatening manner, a kebab spit from a garden barbecue erection, and did strike Margaret Lawler on the shoulder and breast, occasioning burns and lacerations to the upper part of her body, which required a period of 5 weeks in hospital, 14 stitches, and several operations for minor skin grafts. Now, the prosecution will show that this wounding was maliciously intended, and that notwithstanding the fact that the accused and Margaret Lawler had never previously met, the accused had harboured feelings of hostility and resentment towards this woman over a period of time. And the first witness for the prosecution is Margaret Lawler.
Margaret Lawler, please. Will you come this way, please?
What is your religion?
I'm agnostic. I prefer to affirm.
Do you mean you have no religious beliefs?
Yes, that's right.
Please read aloud the words on this card.
I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
You are Margaret Lawler?
I am, or what's left of me.
Mrs. Lawler, you are required to answer the questions without comment or embellishment.
I'm sorry, my lord. Only I've suffered agonies, mental and physical.
Nevertheless, just answer the questions.
I'm sorry, my lord.
And you are a secretary at Arkwright Polytechnic, and you live at 17 Marlborough Mansions, Prince Albert Circus, Fulchester.
Yes, I reside there.
Mrs. Lawler, how long have you lived in Fulchester?
For 9 months. I came at the beginning of the academic year after I divorced my husband in Birmingham.
Do you have many friends in Fulchester?
No. I find it a most lonely place.
Where were you on the evening of June the 15th this year?
At a barbecue party given by Mr. and Mrs. Blandford.
And had you been invited to that party by Mr. and Mrs. Blandford?
No, not exactly.
Could you please tell the court how you came to be present?
Yes, Mr. and Mrs. Sanderson very kindly invited me to accompany them.
And how did you come to know Mr. and Mrs. Sanderson?
Well, Mr. Sanderson is a colleague of mine. He's the general administrator of the catering department of the Arkwright Polytechnic. And as I've told you, I'm a faculty secretary, commerce.
Would you describe the Sandersons as friends of yours?
Oh, yes. They've been most kind.
Now, when did you first meet Mrs. Blandford?
Well, I was introduced to her that evening on the patio.
And how did she behave towards you when you first met?
She became what I can only describe as hostile. No two ways about it.
What grounds do you have for thinking her hostile?
Well, Mr. Sanderson introduced me and she turned her back on me. She just spun round. I thought it rather bad manners on her part.
Did she say anything?
No, she just ignored me.
When was your next encounter with Mrs. Blandford on that evening?
About half an hour later, there was a general conversation on the patio.
What was that conversation about?
Well, the talk got round to sales parties. Mrs. Blandford sells clothes made of suede and leather at these parties. And I said I thought it was thoughtlessly cruel to butcher young animals when man has so many other alternatives at his disposal.
How did Mrs. Blandford react to that?
Well, she became what I can only describe as abusive. I said, well, we'll have to agree to differ. But she wouldn't. She kept following me all round the garden, raising her voice. I was most embarrassed.
Did you drink very much at the party?
No, I'm not a heavy drinker. I've had hepatitis and I'm not allowed to.
Now, did a number of people leave this party soon after 9 o'clock?
Yes, about 15 or 20.
Why did they leave?
They left because of Mrs. Blandford's behaviour.
Is it true that you had another altercation with Mrs. Blandford shortly afterwards?
Yes, but it was none of my choosing. I tried to keep out of her way, but she pursued me everywhere. Somebody asked me my opinion on women's liberation, and I said that although I thought a woman should be 100% woman, I was all for it if it meant being educated and having a career. Well, not that I'm an extremist.
Did the others agree with you?
Yes, they all did, except Mrs. Blandford, of course. I said I made sacrifices to get where I am today, and straight away she turned round and said, "Who to, the goddess of sex?"
What happened then?
Well, I tried to ignore her. I said, well, anyway, I got my diploma, and it was a passport socially to all kinds of people, university professors, people like that. I said I really pitied people who just stayed at home and looked after their children, just becoming cabbages.
How did Mrs. Blandford react to that?
Well, she took it the wrong way. She thought I meant it personally. I'd only just met the woman. How could I?
What happened after that?
Well, I didn't see very much of her for about half an hour. I could hear her voice, of course. The next time I came across her was when I went up to the barbecue. And I was set upon, attacked.
By whom?
By Mrs. Blandford, my hostess.
Now, I know it may be very upsetting for you to go through that experience again, but could you please tell the court exactly what happened?
Yes, well, I went up to the barbecue area because I decided I'd like to have a kebab. Little did I know that I'd end up as one.
Yes, could you just tell us the sequence of events as you remember them and try and keep your very understandable feelings under control?
Well, Mrs. Blandford was dishing out kebabs on long spits, long skewers they were, rotating on this machine.
Mrs. Lawler, will you look at this skewer? It's exhibit number 1, my lord. Was that one of the skewers?
Yes, it was.
I see, carry on.
Well, Mrs. Blandford was taking the skewers off the machine and holding them over people's plates, and she was scraping the meat off them onto the rice. Well, when it was my turn, I held out my plate, and she lunged at me. She went directly for my face with the kebab spit. Red hot it was. Well, I panicked because she was screaming abuse, and I caught this thing right across my shoulder and down across my breast. It was terrible.
Are you certain it wasn't an accident?
Quite certain. It was a deliberate act. She didn't slip. She aimed at me, at my face. I nearly passed out.
Will you tell us what injuries you sustained?
Well, I lost an awful lot of blood. I had to have 14 stitches, and I sustained very severe burns.
Did Mrs. Blandford show any concern over what had happened?
No, I didn't see any sign of any. But then I was in a terrible state. But I didn't see any sign of remorse, nothing like that.
Was an ambulance sent for?
No. Mrs. Sanderson took complete control. She was absolutely wonderful. I can never thank her enough. She drove me to hospital in her car.
I see, yes. Now, before the incident with the kebab spit happened, were you aware of any reason for Mrs. Blandford's apparent animosity toward you?
Well, I think she must be a very unstable person, and she was persecuting me for some reason. She was using me as a scapegoat for something or other.
Did you know that Mrs. Blandford had been Mr. Sanderson's lover?
No. I understood that Mrs. Blandford was happily married. Well, married anyway.
Well, what was the nature of your relationship with Mr. Sanderson?
He was a very close friend.
Is he your lover?
No, he is not.
Mrs. Lawler, we must make this point clear, I'm afraid. Have you had sexual relations with Mr. Sanderson?
Yes, on 1 or 2 occasions, but not for some time, and I certainly don't consider myself to be his lover.
Well, did Mr. Sanderson ever tell you of his former relationship with Mrs. Blandford?
No, I had no idea of it.
Did you ever write personal letters to him?
Yes, once or twice.
Did you write to him in about April of 1973?
Yes.
Is this the letter? It's exhibit number 2, my lord.
Yes, it is, but I don't
Now,
really...
were you aware that this love letter came into the hands of Mrs. Blandford?
No, I can't imagine how that can have happened.
Well, if it wasn't for reasons of sexual jealousy, why on earth do you think Mrs. Blandford attacked you?
I think she felt she was my inferior in some way, my intellectual inferior. I think she felt I was a much more positive person than she could ever hope to be.
Yes, thank you, Mrs. Lawler.
Mrs. Lawler, was the barbecue party on June the 15th a noisy party?
Well, it was a party. You don't expect a deathly silence, do you?
You're not here to ask me questions, Mrs. Lawler. I'm asking you, was it noisy?
Average. Mrs. Blandford was making most of the noise.
Was there a lot to drink?
There was a fair amount.
Well, when people drink a lot, do they not tend to raise their voices to each other?
Not like that.
Mrs. Lawler, you said that Mrs. Blandford was following you about, pursuing you. Do you mean that she was constantly on your trail wherever you went?
Yes.
How many people were there at the party?
40, 45. I didn't count them.
And with 40 people to entertain, she nevertheless found time to follow you about constantly.
Well, not constantly, but whenever there was a lull, she made a beeline for me.
She was the hostess, was she not?
Well, you wouldn't have thought so from the way she was behaving.
Did she shout at anyone else?
Not in the same way. She seemed to have it in for me.
How much did you drink that evening?
I don't remember.
Well, you seem to remember a great many other details about it.
I was on white wine. I wasn't drunk.
Now, when you expressed your views on women's liberation, did everybody but Mrs. Blanford agree with you?
Not everybody.
But you said before that everybody else did agree with you.
The general opinion was in my favour.
And yet you were the one who was singled out, supposedly by Mrs. Blanford, to be stabbed.
Yes.
Well, why weren't the others attacked?
I don't know.
I suggest that your difference of opinion with Mrs. Blanford was slight, and that your perception of the difference was clouded by drink.
No, you know when somebody's insulting you. I wasn't drunk when I got there.
Oh, but you were drunk later then?
No, I've told you, I've got a weak stomach from my hepatitis. I don't drink in quantity.
Well, can you remember what the weather was like that evening?
Yes, it was a lovely, sunny evening. That's why I was wearing a décolleté dress.
But the barbecue was erected on the grassy slope, was it not?
Yes, it wasn't in a proper pit. As barbecues went, I thought it was rather amateur.
And the grass was rather wet?
I didn't notice.
But it had rained heavily that afternoon, had it not?
Yes, but it was dry then. It was a lovely sunny evening.
You would agree that wet grass can present a rather slippery surface, would you not?
Yes, I suppose so.
Now, you say that people came forward with their plates to be served at the barbecue.
Yes.
And they were, in fact, offered the kebab spit and the meat was scraped onto the rice.
Yes, that is how it was done.
Now, it would be possible, would it not, that if a kebab were offered at face level, if the person slipped on the grass, that they would injure the person to whom it was offered?
She lunged at me.
Just answer the question, Mrs. Lawler. It would be possible.
It would be possible, but not in this instance. In this instance, it was deliberate.
You are asking this court to believe, are you, that a hostess at her own party would deliberately attempt to seriously injure a guest who she'd met for the first time that evening, in front of all her friends and over a trivial difference of opinion?
Well, they do say that truth is stranger than fiction, don't they?
When the incident with the kebab spit occurred, you made no immediate accusation of assault. Now, why was that?
I was bleeding. I was shocked.
Perhaps you needed time to work out a scheme of suitable revenge.
I don't think I quite follow.
Well, it was 24 hours after you'd been in hospital that you summoned the police to your bedside and made a formal statement.
I was ill. I couldn't think straight.
Isn't it true, Mrs. Lawler, that you used this unfortunate incident as a pretext for revenge against Mrs. Blanford, to whom you had taken an unreasonable dislike?
If this isn't reason for dislike, I should like to know what is.
Anita Sanderson, please.
What is your religion?
I haven't got one.
Do you wish to affirm?
Very well.
Please read aloud the words on this card.
I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
You are Anita Fleur Sanderson,
I am.
and you live at 19 Winchester Close, Fulchester.
I do.
Now, Mrs. Sanderson, were you at a party in Dorchester Close given by Mr. and Mrs. Blanford on the
Yes.
15th of June?
Yes, I was. If I'd only known what a terrible tragedy the whole thing was going to end in.
Yes. Now, were you a witness of the incident in which Mrs. Lawler received burns and lacerations?
Yes, I was actually standing right beside Christina. That is Mrs. Blanford. I was helping her with the food because I've done a course in cordon bleu, you see.
Yes. Will you tell us exactly what you saw?
Yes. I saw Margaret Lawler come up to the barbecue with my husband. And I was standing with Christine. I saw her go to the fire and take a fresh spit. I thought this was very funny at the time because there was a lot of meat on the one we'd been using. Anyway, Margaret held out her plate. I saw Christine hang on to the spit for the minute, and her knuckles went white. And next thing I knew, she took a dive at Mrs. Lawler with it.
Did she slip?
No, it was a deliberate lunge.
What happened then?
Well, I saw her strike out with a spit. The same minute, Mrs. Lawler sort of fell back a bit, so this thing caught her across the bosom and shoulder. Thank heavens. I could swear that thing was aimed at her face. And I say, thank heavens. Because if it had got her in the face, she would have had to have plastic surgery. And I speak as a registered beautician, my lord.
Was Mrs. Blanford silent as she struck Mrs. Lawler?
No, she was screaming. She was absolutely hysterical. I don't think she was coherent.
What did you do when you saw what had happened?
Well, of course, the whole place was in an absolute uproar. I took one look at Mrs. Lawler and I thought, Well, there's no point in us twiddling our thumbs while we wait for the ambulance men to finish their game of cards. And I got my new Avenger sitting in the driveway, so I thought, well, I'll drive her to hospital myself, which of course I did.
Yes. Were you aware of any animosity between Mrs. Blandford and Mrs. Lawler earlier that evening?
Yes, I'm afraid I was.
And how did the animosity arise?
Well, it took the form of a sort of dispute about whether women should have careers or be stay-at-home mice. It got rather nasty.
Yeah, so that's one reason. Can you think of any other reason why there should be animosity between these two women?
Well, yes, but I would rather not disclose it.
If you know anything that is pertinent to this case, you must not conceal it, however painful it may be to you or to anyone else. You are here to tell the whole truth.
Well, the thing is, my husband had been having an affair with Mrs. Blandford.
Can you substantiate that allegation?
Yes, indeed, Trevor told me himself.
Yes, but do you have any evidence?
Yes, I saw them together. You see, Christine used to come over to our house every Thursday evening, and though I always used to try to be out, you know, one can't always arrange these things absolutely to the minute, can one?
Did they go to bed together?
Yes. Occasionally I'd come home and I'd find them in the bath together. We have a double bath.
Yes, quite so. So they were having an affair?
Yes.
But can you see why that should be a reason for Mrs. Blandford to attack Mrs. Lawler?
Well, yes, I'm afraid my husband's affair with Mrs. Blandford cooled off a bit. They do, you know.
Why was that?
Well, frankly, he'd met somebody else.
Who was that somebody else?
Margaret Lawler. They worked together. We were all very good friends.
How did you know of this affair?
Trevor brought Margaret home.
Did they sleep together?
Yes, well, only once, actually, as far as I was aware.
And how did you become aware of it?
I saw them.
You will behave yourself with propriety, madam, in this court, whatever you choose to do outside.
So your husband formed a close association with Margaret Lawler
Yes.
after his affair with Christine Blandford had ended?
No, not exactly. These things rather tend to overlap, don't they?
Now, were you the only person to know of this situation?
No, that was the terrible thing. Christine found out.
How did you find out?
Well, she found a letter from Margaret to my husband in Trevor's pocket.
Is that the letter? It's Exhibit 2 again, Little.
Yes, that's it.
Now, what was the reaction of the accused on seeing that letter?
Oh, she worked herself up into a state of absolute hysteria. I said to her, now look, there is absolutely no point in you working yourself into a lather over Trevor because he's a butterfly person. Just flits from flower to flower. That's the way it is, whether we like it or not. I said, now look, I am married to him. I'm not jealous. So why on earth you should be in such a stew about it, I just can't think.
Mrs. Sanderson, would you say you were reasonably observant about people's behaviour?
Yes, I am. I'm a fairly acute observer of people's moods. I'm a big believer in psychology. I rather think it holds the key to our behaviour.
And from your observation of Mrs. Blandford, would you say that her jealousy was so intense as to be likely to make her violent?
Well, she did threaten a lot of things. You know, I really didn't take much notice of it.
Why?
Well, because I think we're civilized people. We ought to be able to accept these things and take them in our stride.
Am I to understand that you connived at your husband's adultery and furthermore did not think it was unusual?
I am sorry, my lord, but really there'd been little point in doing anything else.
I see. Well, Mr. Lloyd.
No further questions.
Is that all? Goodness, I thought it was going to be much worse.
No, Mrs. Sanderson, I have some questions for
Oh,
you.
yes, of course.
Would you say your husband was an insensitive or brutal man?
Oh, good heavens, no. He's very considerate.
Was he considerate, do you think, in taking along his wife and mistress to a party given by a former mistress?
Well, we don't see it like that.
Would you say you loved your husband?
I should say he's about the best friend that I've ever had in the world.
Yes, but do you love him?
Yes, I do.
Well, if you love someone, surely you don't condone their adultery with another woman.
Oh, look, I really had very little choice, you know. It was either that or losing completely.
I see. Are you usually so friendly toward your husband's lovers?
Yes.
And would you say that this was normal behaviour?
Well, it's probably not, but that's not my fault, is it?
Mrs. Sanderson, you say that you're very perceptive about
Yes,
people.
I am. I have to be. I'm a beautician. You can't do that kind of work without considerable psychological insights.
Quite. Well, if you're as perceptive as you claim to be, I suggest it is well within your powers of competence to ascribe to Mrs. Blandford a false motive for something that was purely an accident and thus make it appear to be an assault.
Why on earth should I want to do that?
Perhaps in order to be revenged on her for taking your husband away from you.
That is an absurd suggestion.
Will you expect this court to believe, do you, that you accept your husband's mistresses with complete equanimity?
I don't follow that question.
Mrs. Sanderson, you appear to be very unconcerned about your husband's women. Could this be because you and your husband have decided, as it were, to go your own separate ways?
I don't follow you.
Well, if your husband had extramarital affairs, did you do likewise?
Affairs, no. Relationships, perhaps, and then only one.
Or will you please tell me the name of the person with whom you had the one relationship?
No.
Miss Tate, how is this question pertinent?
It concerns a person deeply involved in the case, my lord.
Yes, well, do we really need to delve any deeper into this ménage?
Well, I would be obliged if you'd allow me to put this one question, my lord.
Well, very well, if you insist. You will answer the question that Miss Tate has put to you.
Very well. If you must know, his name is Doug Blandford.
You have a sexual relationship with the defendant's husband.
It's not only sexual.
Well, would you say that you are passionately involved with Mr.
I am
Blandford?
involved with him. yes.
Passionately?
Deeply, perhaps.
Passionately, even.
Maybe.
So it would be convenient for you if Mrs. Blandford were out of the way.
Look, she isn't in my way, no.
But you've just said you're deeply involved with her husband. She must be in your way, mustn't she?
Look, you simply don't understand this, do you? This is part of the whole thing.
Well, would you kindly explain to us what you mean when you say it's part of the whole thing?
I do love Douglas Blandford, but I certainly don't want to live with him or anything like that.
Am I to understand, Mrs. Sanderson, that although you admit to great involvement with Mr. Blandford, you would not wish to marry him at any cost, however, even if you were free to do so?
Yes, my lord, that's right.
I see.
Thank you, Mrs. Sanderson. I have no further questions.
No re-examination, my lord.
Very well. You may stand up.
I call Dennis William Curtis.
Dennis William Curtis, please.
You are Dennis William Curtis,
I am.
and you live at 40 Dorchester Close, Fulchester.
I do. I'm an immediate neighbour of Mr. and Mrs. Blandford.
Were you present at a party given by the Blandfords on June the 15th?
Yes, I was, unfortunately.
Unfortunately.
Well, it was scarcely a pleasure, as things turned out.
Did you witness the incident in which Margaret Lawler was injured?
Indeed, I did.
Where were you standing?
Well, I was standing behind Mrs. Lawler, slightly to her left. I had a perfectly clear view of everything that happened.
Will you please describe what you saw?
I saw Mrs. Lawler take a clean plate from the pile and advance towards the barbecue. Mrs. Blandford took up a fresh spit roast from the revolving roast spit. I thought this was rather odd, because she seemed to have sufficient meat on the roast she was using already to have served at least one more person. And Mrs. Blandford's voice rose to screaming pitch, and in the pretence of offering Mrs. Lawler the kebab, she lurched forward.
Now, do you know of any reason why Mrs. Blandford should harbour any resentment towards Mrs. Lawler?
I knew her to have been in an adulterous relationship with Mrs. Sanderson.
How did you know that?
I had encountered them in an hotel together
Where was that?
in Preston,
When was
on
that?
the 18th of April this year. I was spending the week in Preston supervising the rationalisation of my firm's work branch in Preston. Fibre Synth always ensured that a suite is available at the Royal George Hotel for its executives. I met Mrs. Blandford and Mr. Sanderson in this same hotel.
Are you sure it was they?
Yes, positive. I was quite surprised to meet them without their respective marriage partners, and somewhat embarrassed, of course. I observed they signed the hotel register as Mr. and Mrs. Sanderson.
Well, perhaps they'd taken separate accommodation.
No, they were in a double room.
Did they appear embarrassed to see you?
Not really. I met them in the restaurant. Mr. Sanderson gave me to understand this was a perfectly normal procedure. He went to Preston simply to avoid what he referred to as tittle-tattle. I told him, of course, I thought it was no business of mine.
Now, was that an isolated instance, or were there any other occasions on which you saw them together?
Oh, yes. They were always quite open about it. I saw them in their garden, sunbathing. Their talk was disgusting.
The case of the Queen against Blandford will be resumed tomorrow in the Crown Court.
Well, I must put this one over here. I mean, we'll have some starch if you'd like it. We must keep it up.